Welcome to Text on Texts. This is Jed Sunwall. Today, I'm talking to George Dyson. We're going to talk about the book The Voice of the Dolphins by Leo Szilard. We're also going to talk about a book that George wrote called Anthology. Now, George is a fascinating guy, and you should know that I actually don't know him that well. I know his daughter from a long time ago, and I know his sister because she was on the board of a startup that I worked for a long time ago. But the Dyson family is fascinating. George is the son of Freeman Dyson, who was a theoretical physicist and a contemporary of Oppenheimer's and of Szilard's. Szilard was actually a collaborator with Einstein, and he's the person who came up with the theory of nuclear chain reaction. And he's a fascinating figure in his own right. So I'm not going to spoil the conversation. I really do highly recommend that you read Voice of the Dolphins. It's available for free. I'm including links in the show notes. I got it for 99 cents and read it on the Kindle on my phone. It's a fascinating story written by a guy who was very concerned about how to save the world after having contributed to the creation of nuclear weaponry. So this is a fascinating, very wide-ranging conversation about AI, geopolitics, and humanity. So let's go. Joining us today is George Dyson, author and historian, I think is how I've seen you described. But George, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience?
Yes, George Dyson, known for writing books, which means I'm sort of a storyteller. You look at the past, the stories have to be kind of retold every 50 or 100 years, and that's what I do. And
do you consider yourself a technologist?
Yes, I'm definitely a technologist. I mean, I'm here in a large, sprawling workshop where I build boats, and that's one of the oldest technologies, and that used to be my whole life. So I'm definitely a technologist.
Okay, I was guessing you were going to say that. I was guessing you were going to mention the boats as a technology. Tell us more, because I'm fascinated by this stuff, and I think a lot of people will be as well.
That's where the whole theme we're going to talk about books, I mean, is so important. You somehow your life is shaped by books you read, and the very first grown-up book I read was Kon-Tiki. I was probably 8 years old. I read that book, and that became my life. I just wanted to build that raft and go on that trip, and did it in a different way. But it definitely sort of cast my path the way all the people you talk to are going to say that there was some book that changed their life as a child. That's why books are so important.
Yeah. And we can talk about books as technology as well. But and Kon-Tiki, if I remember correctly from your book, Anthology, and am I pronouncing it the way you wish people to pronounce it?
I would say Anthology, but there's analog and there's logic, and the G is different, but it's the same.
Yeah.
It's an interesting question what analogia actually means. I don't know, but it's the logic and logos is word, and logic, and analogy is sort of non-verbal computation, right. non-coded computation.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
It's very important. That's the new thing, and we're ignoring the fact that we're diving into it.
Let me double click on that. Diving into non-encodable?
Yes, into non-digital computation, which is a very big thing that's being ignored.
Yeah, well, I highly recommend the book, Anthology. I'll say it like that. Technically, it should be because there's an I after the G, and so that should soften the G. So, Anthology. Anyway, you mentioned your encounter with Kon-Tiki in that book, and that sets you off on a path towards learning about like lashing. I think like lashing things together.
Yes,
is that right?
They lashed the raft. There was no way balsa wood is sort of like a sponge. How can you, if you drive nails into it, they come right out. So they immediately realized they had to lash the thing together. And then all I did as a kid was lash stuff together. I lashed a huge 40-foot high bamboo radio antenna and stuff like that. It just obsessed me that you could lash things together.
Okay. And so this is your entree into the technology of lashing, like getting things to stick together, which has led to boats and specifically kayaks. Is that right? It's your expertise?
Yes, because it's, when you're kind of poor and homeless, you try to do the most with the least, and kayaks are sort of the ultimate optimization. How do you build the most boat with the least amount of material, or the most seaworthy boat? And kayaks were absolutely the peak of that evolution. So
Right.
I was drawn to them.
Okay. And so, yeah, so this sort of like scarcity driving technological development is also something I think that's worth discussing a little bit here, because I would say like a lot of I think it's sort of like my audience, or like the audience that I imagine is out there, are people who are interested in modern technologies, like internet enabled technologies and computation, which I would say over the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years has had abundant resources, hasn't been too constrained. And I'm curious to get your take if you feel like there's something that we're missing out because of that. Because of the constraints of technology that led you to focusing on kayaks, and there's an elegance to that. And I think it spurs innovation in different ways. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yes, and of course it used to be that way in computation. I mean, actually, literally on the other side of that wall is a bathroom, and on the wall in the bathroom is which I found in the garbage, is a 1 kilobit memory board. So it's a back plane of a memory stack that held, and it was the price of a car at the time. You could buy a good new car for less than that memory board. And so early coding, I mean, the early programming was driven by that constraint of, every bit is going to cost something terrible. And of course we've long, now it's literally, I mean, the reverse problem. Now sort of the mission of half the people doing coding is kind of to use more, use up the bandwidth that's there, try and fill it up.
Yeah, no, the economics of this are fascinating. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion. That's an entire course in information theory and economics. So I reached out to you. I'm so grateful for responding, and you gave me way more books to read than anyone has so far. So I've always asked people, what would you like to read? And I think you gave me quite a list. But I actually am grateful for this, because I've read 2 of them, and I'm starting the 3rd. But it was Voice of the Dolphins by Leo Szilard, The Black Cloud, which I should have gathered my notes on this. Do you remember who wrote The Black Cloud?
Fred Hoyle.
Fred Hoyle.
I have them all here. So
okay. Oh, excellent. Oh, you've got the original. All right.
Yeah. Freeman Dyson, May 1958. So
nice. Oh man!
Literally, that's the copy I read as a child on the shelf. And, so
that's awesome.
But,
just to clarify for people, Freeman Dyson is your dad.
Yes, right? and Esther, who introduced us, is my sister. So
that's right. Okay,
and her book, just to get that childhood book thing. One of the books she was obsessed with was Danny Dunn and the Homework Machine, a science fiction book for kids about a kid who builds a computer that does his homework. So you can see how Esther turned out, right? She just gravitated to the personal computer industry.
Okay, I'm trying to get Esther on the podcast too.
Yeah, she'd be good.
So Voice of the Dolphins, The Black Cloud, and then another one you gave me is Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke, which I've just started. But
1953. So.
Incredible. But the framing you gave was that you were very interested in, you wanted to discuss literature that's been written by scientists. Is that right?
Yes. Well, you mentioned science fiction, and that's just so vast. Like, how could we begin to talk about sort of the influence of science fiction on tech? So I don't know if anybody else subscribes to this, but there's a very narrow definition of science fiction, which is fiction that is actually written by scientists, because quite a number of scientists have, and often under pseudonyms, because it's, they didn't want to ruin their career. Right. They would write science fiction novels. It was a way to sort of get out of the laboratory. And so Fred Hoyle was a very good astronomer. And Arthur Clarke, we forget, was actually a scientist too, sort of developed the idea of orbiting satellites. And then the other one I think I mentioned to you, is The Tale of the Big Computer by
Oh, that's right.
Olof Johannsen, which is a pseudonym for Hannes Alfveen. And Hannes Alfveen was won the Nobel in magnetohydrodynamics, but didn't dare publish under his own name. So.
Right. Okay. Well, it's a great syllabus. I'll include links to all of these in the show notes. But I think as we discussed, for the purposes of this podcast, we'll stick to one work at a time,
Yep.
and maybe we can discuss others in the future. So, correct me here. So you know Szilard, or you knew him?
He died just before. I mean, we came to. My father lived in Princeton, New Jersey, and in this very boring theoretical life. And then in 1958, he got brought out to La Jolla, where you went to school.
Yeah.
And suddenly became an experimentalist. He got brought out to work on this spaceship, and that was right after Leo Szilard had died.
Okay.
Tragically. But Leo Szilard's widow, Trudy Szilard, or Trudy Weiss, she was still there, and she was sort of like, took the role of like our aunt. She didn't have her own family, and so she came over all the time, and she did something very important with me. She would come every Friday. I was then I was 11 years old and very unhappy, kind of your classic misfit middle school kid. And
yeah.
Leo had died, and Trudy was still there. And she would come to the school every Friday and sign me out. You had to be signed out by a grown-up. And she'd sign me out on Friday and take me to lunch at the La Valencia, which was this beautiful kind of deco hotel on the La Jolla waterfront, where she actually had lived for quite a while.
Oh, wow.
She I think, was reasonably wealthy. And she would just take me to lunch, and she would have a pink martini and shrimp, and I would eat, white bread or whatever. and we would talk. She just would talk to me like a grown-up, and I don't know why she, it was they were like dates. It just was. We had fascinating conversation, and of course, she gave me the book, The Voice of the Dolphins.
Okay.
And that's what I remember. I don't, if you ask me
interesting.
What did you talk about at lunch? I really can't remember what we talked about, but she was really on my case, which I credit her for telling me that, I don't need to be a scientist. It's like when you're the kid of a, guy like Freeman Dyson.
Yeah.
Most people, the first thing is, what kind of physicist do you want to be?
Right.
And she was the opposite. She said, you don't need to be a physicist at all. And that helped.
That's wonderful. And so that freed you up to focus on lashing, to pursue.
It did in a way. And then the book, the book just made me want to go live with the Dolphins. I mean, it just.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to recount the story for people. I mean, the format of this podcast, my assumption is we're going to talk about a piece of work. I sort of broadcast in advance, what the upcoming episodes are going to be about. I'm under no delusions that everybody will have read it. But it's all, we don't have to worry about spoilers or anything like that, especially for a book that's over like 60 or 70 years old at this point. So it's a story about, a world in which, we're confronted with the problem of nuclear disarmament or otherwise, sort of control international agreements on nuclear weaponry, which was top of mind for Szilard. Well, actually, sorry, before I go down this path, explain who he is and why he's significant here.
I mean, we really have to. Szilard, is a very important and unique character. He's the guy who was a brilliant physicist who worked. Lots of people claim to have worked with Einstein, but Leo Szilard really worked with Einstein. Actually, they actually hold a joint patent on a method of refrigeration, which is still way ahead of refrigerators we use. And he came to America, but he's the guy who was walking across the street in London when he realized that you could have a nuclear chain reaction and build a bomb.
Right.
And he became obsessed with that. And so he's the person who actually wrote the letter that Einstein is famous for sending to Roosevelt, was actually written by Szilard.
Oh, wow.
And that, became the Manhattan Project and everything else. But he was very against using the weapons, and of course felt, worked for the rest of his life to try and keep them from ever being used again.
Right, okay. And so that's perfect. That's a great intro to sort of the thrust of the book. So there's this problem that needs to be dealt with. And so I love this kind of stuff, having studied political science. So he describes a research institute in Vienna, of all places, where some researchers figure out a way to communicate with dolphins. Once again, why this happened in Vienna, no idea. A pretty landlocked city. But it turns out dolphins are highly intelligent, and that the only reason we haven't really heard from them before is that they just don't have the dexterity to write things down or build anything. But once we learn how to communicate with them, they're able to give us great ideas in terms of like global governance. And it becomes this like policy think tank where the voice of the dolphins it's a bunch of dolphins telling us how to get our act together and control nuclear weaponry. Is that fair to say?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of
Okay.
it's like what we're doing today with AI. We sort of feel it like this voice of reason is going to step in and straighten things out for us.
That's right. Yeah. And I guess the other kicker is that they also invent some like highly efficient way of producing protein using algae that becomes like, yeah, go on.
And also universal birth control.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
So like they solve these like huge like population, like species level issues that also generates tons of revenue for their institute, which allows them to lobby all over the world to like, have things done their way. So it's a really funny to me, this sort of fantasy. And especially if you think about it from like his perspective, is that like he's jotting down a bunch of like policy ideas, and he's saying, well, these aren't my ideas. They're coming from a super intelligent group of dolphins, which somehow like makes him go down a little bit easier than it's just like, here's my wacky ideas. Is that the fair assessment of what was going on there?
And my understanding is that he just sat down in his apartment. He was recovering from cancer, and that he just dictated the book. He just Trudy held the tape recorder, and the story came out, and then she, again, is one of these uncredited people who I think actually typed it up into a book. Otherwise, it just would have been forgotten.
Yeah,
and it's not a book; it's a long, short story.
Yeah, it's more like maybe not even a novella. That's a long, short story is the right way to describe it. It's funny you mentioned the ChatGPT thing. I'm looking at my notes of it, and so I actually have I'll read a passage from the book that I jotted down. Because of their lack of manual dexterity, the dolphins were not able to perform experiments. In time, however, they began to suggest to the staff experiments in the biological field, and soon thereafter it became apparent that the staff of the institute might be relegated to performing experiments thought up by the dolphins. I've had this experience where I asked ChatGPT to write a proposal for a project. So somebody proposed, so I run a nonprofit. Somebody proposed a project to me, and I was like, oh, all right, I've got to write a proposal for this. I asked ChatGPT to write it, and it was like 95% great. And I was like, all right, well, I changed a few things and sent it back, and we won the project, and now we're doing it. And so it's sort of continually reminding myself that I'm doing work that this AI cooked up. And there's something funny about it, that because it's an AI that did it, I don't really mind, because I'm like, oh, that's, there's no one to blame. And I wonder if this concept of the dolphins being another species that communicate differently, that would allow us, if we did have super intelligent dolphins telling us what to do, we might be more likely to accept what they had to say, because we can't relate to them.
Yes, and Leo was very, because of going into World War II, it was the 1930s, and the League of Nations had started, and everybody had great hopes for it. I think that's why his organization is in Vienna.
Right.
And
okay.
And then coming out of World War II, they all, I'm saying we in the sense of physicists, all thought that firmly believed that the United Nations would have to step in. I mean, that this would, in fact, that was what people believe would be really one of the good effects of the bomb, and that was the plan Oppenheimer subscribed to, that was called the Baruch plan, that the United Nations would take control of nuclear weapons, and then it would sort of be like the Dolphins. It would enforce world peace. But what they didn't count on, and I think that's a bit of what Leo is got an axe to grind with it. They didn't count on the AEC, the Atomic Energy Commission, the sort of the Lewis Strauss side of things, where the people in these agencies said, no, we're going to keep control of these weapons, and it was a great tragedy.
Well, this is okay. You've just opened the door to something. So we're not necessarily talking about the Black Cloud now, but I think both this book, The Voice of the Dolphins, and the Black Cloud deal with the fact that there is a sort of a fundamental mismatch between scientists and, I would say, the scientific method, empiricism, and political structures that are actually, political structures that are pretty good at accruing and holding on to power. Do you want to talk about that at all? I mean, I'll just open that door and let you comment on that.
Yes, I mean that is the problem, and people like Leo Szilard, we forget how close these people were brought to. He had an audience with the president. The door was open, and even more so with Einstein. Yet they found themselves powerless to. Einstein also worked to the rest of his life trying to, realize it's the international organization that would make sense of things. And in that sense, the United Nations was a spectacular failure. That it's been good at, small things, but not very successful at the big things. And we're not going to talk about that book, but Childhood's End is the same thing. I mean, it's aliens who come and take our children. That's how they do it. They sort of
Oh, you just spoiled it for me. That's fine.
But it's there's a theme to this whole. I mean, all these scientists who survived World War II, I think all saw that as let alone my own father, who worked for Bomber Command.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's the sort of the interesting thing here is that so this is actually the 20th century. I think is just so interesting to study, especially at this point. Is that all these books that you've mentioned, and certainly I just think the circumstances of your father's job and work were all made possible by these massive nation states that were incredibly powerful. That was a totally novel thing in the 20th century, and certainly novel for the U.S. to emerge as a superpower after the World Wars. The other thing that I think plays quite heavily, certainly in the Black Cloud and in Voice of the Dolphins, is global communications as well. The advent of that we all take that for granted. So I've got another passage I'll just read. So the first investment made by the Vienna Institute. So at this point, we're talking about an institute that's run by dolphins, in case that wasn't already clear, was the purchase of television stations in a number of cities all over the world. Thereafter, the television programs of these stations carried no advertising, since they no longer had to aim their programs at the largest possible audience. There was no longer any need for them to cater to the tastes of morons. It's great. It's just great to imagine him dictating this. This freedom from the need of maximizing their audience led to a rapid evolution of the art of television, the potential of which had been frequently surmised but never actually realized. So again, this is because they were able to develop this protein, this food product that was a massive source of incredible revenue. They immediately take over the global media. All right,
just like
this is a huge jumping off point.
Google with advertising and YouTube. I mean, it's
right. Yeah. No, I mean, well, geez. I mean, while we're at it, if we're reading stuff, I've got notes from Anthology as well that I can pull up, but where you describe in pretty stark terms what Google actually is. It is, hang on here. Automata, advertising, and natural selection are an explosive mix. Google's introduction of AdWords, monetizing not just language already coded, but also meaning, not fully coded yet, was the equivalent of Lee DeForest introducing the control grid into Fleming's vacuum tube. Internet advertising drives a global high-gain amplifier connecting the reward sought by computers to the reward sought by humans. We set loose an evolutionary system that rewards machines that learn to control both how we feel and what we think. Okay, so those are two jumping off points to discuss, like the importance of I don't know, like I guess the clash of global media, just broadly, and the notion of nation states, and that are always trying to sort of vie for power. This is a huge can of worms I just opened, but I'll just let you respond to, your thoughts on how these two things interact.
Yeah, well, I mean, we're definitely in a new regime now where we always, again, the science fiction novels would predict this, but we're kind of there now where we have global corporations that do have more power than most countries, and
yeah,
that's sort of the main concern we have right now, particularly because we believe in democracies. That's the other side of the sword. That if you do have a democracy, then the power of media becomes, in a lot of ways, more powerful because they can influence there's a technical problem that there are these sort of turning points that happen in technology. Like one of them I've always interested me is that at what point at an airport does it become cheaper to rent a car for the day than to park a car for the day? And there's a transition point there. And then with information storage, there's a point at which it's cheaper to just buy more storage than to make a decision to throw stuff away.
Right.
And with voting, there's also a turning point when we become better at predicting how people will vote and then influencing how they vote. We're better at that than we are at actually counting the votes. Is the real fundamental problem. That the method of counting the votes is still 19th century technology, and the method of predicting and influencing is state of the art, and it's a unstable situation.
Right. So you're saying because you can buy elections much more effectively because you just have to persuade people in these very simplistic
you're
ways.
Able to identify how people are going to vote and then influence that. You get these knife edge elections that are where the margin is within the bounds of what we're able to count, because we still count with a very crude system, and that just by its nature is going to create problems.
Yeah. Well, it ends up being our political system is a sorting algorithm, or something like that. It's driving a sorting algorithm that just divides people up into two camps, and remarkably well. I mean, to your point about these like knife's edge elections, you see them everywhere at state level or referenda, the national level. Like it's always so close. It's amazing to see. Are you advocating for? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you like ranked choice voting or other counting methods that would be better?
Yes. Again, I don't spend much time thinking about that. That's again something that Danny Hillis has thought about a lot. He has his own way to solve it. But I'm half Canadian, I'm dual Canadian US, so I've always found that I like the Canadian system better, where you have multiple parties. Canada, we always have a strong opposition, and it's that opposition that sort of moves the needle instead of just being locked in we have an opposition that is much more free to adopt policies that will shift them. So I think that's better. But we've, again, in America, we're having no luck at all with third parties.
No, and I think that's a function of how we count votes, for sure. So, okay. So anyhow, but the point is here is that like we have, going back to this clash of like national or international cooperation and media. I'll just say this, like Szilard's solution is to have, once again, a super intelligent group of dolphins control the world's media. And because they're benevolent, they are going to tell us, they're going to give us good content, and people will all be smarter as a result. There's an undercurrent throughout his book as well, is that if only the scientists were in charge, then everybody would be making better decisions, which is a very charitable view of scientists, and that's fine. But I would just say, like, I guess what it comes down to is that there's a mistrust of politicians and political structures that I think he bore the scars to understand why we should not trust politicians. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. So tell me about your experience. So you read the book. Aunt Trudy gave it to you. You read it. Do you have any recollection of how this landed with you at that time in your pre-teens?
At that time I was, my real hero there in La Jolla was, like, my hero in Princeton was Julian Bigelow, the engineer who worked for von Neumann and built had an airplane engine in his living room and that kind of thing. And in La Jolla, the same thing. We had a neighbor, Walter Munk, which may well be why the Vienna Institute is in Austria, because Walter Munk was, one of the great oceanographers of the 20th century or ever, and he was from Austria. Again, growing up as a kid in Austria, which has no oceans, he became obsessed with it. And anyway, he ended up, he was friends with the Szilards and von Neumann, that whole group, but he was a working oceanographer. He was out on ships, voyages. He led the voyage that tried to dig a hole through the mantle, and he took John Steinbeck along as like a deckhand to write stories.
Oh, wow.
You go to his house, and at the dinner table, he's, that's the chair that John Steinbeck sat in.
Wow. Did you take him to the Sea of Cortez? For the longest Sea of Cortez?
No, but he took Steinbeck along on several of the scripts. He sort of turned Scripps Institute into a thriving thing. But anyway, I saw.
Yeah.
But he actually had machine shops and boats, and that's what I want. I wanted to go out there and build boats. So the book, I just got the dolphin part, that these dolphins are out there. We just aren't listening to them.
No, it's a beautiful image. So you're just this little kid just imagining, like, we just got to find these dolphins. Like, it's plausible.
Yeah, and the amazing thing was that it only took a few years. I mean, that was 1964. I was 11, and then six years later, it's 1970. I'm up in Canada and British Columbia, off, making underwater recordings of killer whales, who are the dolphins. I mean, it's just
amazing.
The last 6 years, like, nothing's happened to me. It's just, when you're young, life changes so fast.
Yeah. No, it's incredible. You were able to pursue this dream a little bit. I mean, going and recording marine life.
Yeah. I would never, I mean, again, I've never imagined that it is amazing how if you decide you want to do something, somehow things will fall into place and you get there.
Yeah. Well, especially at such a young age, being introduced to these ideas and
then the world sort of came along. I mean, there really is a large it's no longer at all a wild, crazy idea to say that, that the cetaceans, whales, and dolphins have real intelligence in a way that we don't fully understand.
Right. Yeah, I mean, let's explore that a little bit, though. I mean, so certainly, there are lots of different kinds of intelligence that we certainly can't understand. You talk about this a little bit in Anthology as well, about, I think you had this image of a tree being a neuron.
Of trees having like networks, trees being a communication network, which again now is a sort of respectable. There's a scientist at UBC just north of here who's really respectable for that theory now.
Yeah,
it's not a theory; it's been proven and shown.
Yeah, actually, I have a book somewhere back there. It's I haven't read it yet, but I think it's called The Sounds of Nature. But it's also just about like sort of auditory communication happening throughout different forms of life, I think, including plants, that we're just now becoming aware of. And it's just a lot of things we just couldn't perceive. So we just assumed they weren't happening because we can't hear them. But in terms of like cooperation, so I mean, humans appear to be somewhat, uniquely capable of coordinating and cooperating at large scale. Do you foreclose that? Is that something that's happening among other species as well? Do you have thoughts?
I think it clearly is. I mean, the classic is ant colonies and things like that. There was individual ants are not particularly intelligent, but colony is almost super intelligent. And with whales, which is what fascinates me. I think we're still hugely on the wrong path. I mean, when I went up to do this work with killer whales 55 years ago, the scientists were saying, we're going to record, because whales are communicating all the time with sound. We're going to record this and we're going to decipher the language. And it's 50 years later, no one has even begun to decipher any whale language, and I think they're just fundamentally mistaken that whales don't need a language, because they see the world with sound and they communicate with sounds. As if we could communicate with light, we wouldn't have to develop a linear, symbolically coded language that allows me to say cat, and then you reconstruct that in your mind to an image of a cat. I just would send you an image of a cat,
right?
So we would have communication, but it would not necessarily at all be language as we know it, and that's
right.
That's
we're in a way we're doing that right now, right? I mean, it's certainly with this podcast, it's going to be some binaries. It's just like an MP3, I guess, I'll upload somewhere, and it's going to convey a lot of information much more quickly. But the coordination is, I think it still seems to be sort of like we scheme to do things in a way at a species level that I think is fascinating.
Yes, and then we develop writing, of course. I mean, language was one thing, but writing was another, and then you sort of it communicates over time.
Right. Well, yeah, that's right. Well, an abstract thought as well. So like we can imagine things. I mean, this is something I think Yuval Harari talks about a lot in 'Sapiens. I don't know if you read that, but him summarizing it as fictions, that we're able to just come up with ideas like money, for example. And we agree to delude ourselves to believe that it's all real. And that's amazing. But this is actually a good time for me to bring up something we discussed before, but like this thing you said when you were on Sam Harris's podcast years ago, within the context of AI alignment. And so going back to the idea of the Vienna Institute, these dolphins telling us what to do, and the corollary of that with something like ChatGPT, or some sort of, like a technological innovation that's going to tell us what to do and help us be better. There's this concern about alignment, which I guess I'll go on record. I haven't thought a ton about alignment other than, I've listened to podcasts and I work in stuff that's related to AI. So the concept comes up to me, but it seems wholly silly to me.
Yeah.
And anyway, what you said all of the most terrible things that have ever happened in the world happened because someone wanted them. There's no safety in that. The point being that, like, if this idea that we come up with an idea of like what was aligned with human interests would protect us somehow, you seem skeptical of that.
Yes. I mean, it's provably wrong. I mean, it's just that, just the fact that people want it, and how do you decide who are the people who get to want it? That's the fatal flaw in the immortality of people. I mean, who believe, we're going to have immortality for everybody, but that who decides who gets the immortality,
right?
And it's not going to end well. It never ends well. So,
well, if we, I guess, extend that further. So let's imagine we wave a wand where everyone gets to be immortal. We still have to contend with scarce resources to be divided up among those who remain mortal. So I guess is what this leads us to is this idea of alignment, or this understanding is just a fantasy that somehow we'll know we'll figure out the answer at some point and then we'll be saved. And I think that's a fantasy.
Yes.
Okay. But I guess I would say, like, do you believe that Szilard had an answer, or is this story mostly him exploring how complicated it would be to get this right?
Yeah, I don't think he had an answer. I think he may have believed at one time there was an answer and was probably somewhat disappointed and cynical. I mean, what I heard from Ted Taylor, who had gone to actually first to Washington to work for the Defense Nuclear Agency, and then to Vienna to work for the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is also in Vienna. And he said that when he last saw Leo Szilard was staying in a hotel on DuPont Circle and going to Congress and just sitting in the lobby with, he had a rack of his books and was trying to give them out to people. I mean, he really ended up as sort of this voice in the wilderness. When you have to remember that's the peak Cold War, where we're building nuclear weapons as fast as we can, and didn't look good. So I think my sense is the voice of the Dolphins was sort of his way of saying something, but not, it's going to take a supernatural kind of, like the Dolphins are going to have to straighten this out.
Right. Well, and he also does some interesting work. I guess sort of going back to the question of alignment, of just like how hard this would actually be. And like, he describes these scenarios wherein like, there's a scheme where if Russia decides to nuke an American city, America promises, well, if you do that, if you launch a nuke at like any of our allies, we will destroy 2 of your cities. Yeah. They're like, okay, fine. Then we'll destroy 2 of your cities. But we'll give you warning so you can evacuate them. And, there should be time to get people out, but like, you should know, like, if you do this, we'll warn you, and then we're going to destroy 2 of your cities. And then he keeps pulling on the thread where it's like the construction industry is just like, okay, that's fine. Like, that's actually great, because then we could get the contracts to rebuild the cities. And so, but it becomes farcical. And I think that's the point, is that you're like, these are like horrifying questions to have to contend with. And there is not going to be an answer to this. It does feel unanswerable.
Yeah, I don't think he gets there, but that, again, at that time we were still in a 2-power world. We had the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and then you can sort of play all these games were played at the Rand Corporation.
Right.
But if you have a third power, it all blows up. You suddenly don't have you no longer have a predictable game.
Right. Well, it's funny actually. I mean, he mentions. I took notes on this as well. Is that there was this issue with there was no political structure in Europe. And in fact, I mean, he says it quite well. He says that the difficulties of Europe to the fact that the political structure in Europe did not reflect the economic interdependence of the nations of Europe. So the point being that like Europe was a power because the different economies of Europe were so interdependent that if only they could coordinate, they would actually like throw their weight around. And he says, the steering committee took a dim view, however, the possibility of bringing about political integration of Europe through the creation of supranational political agencies. Very funny to read that now that we have the European Union.
Yeah, but
that is certainly throwing its weight around.
Yeah, and very relevant right now to sort of Moscow trying to get Ukraine back. My father, by the way, I can't find it. He ever wrote this down, but he used to tell me that what really kept him awake at night wasn't a U.S.-Soviet nuclear war breaking out, but a Moscow-Ukraine, like a civil war back. At one time, for a long time, Ukraine was the third largest nuclear. A third of the third largest group of nuclear weapons were in Ukraine, and his fear was that there was this sort of cultural split between the Russians and the Ukrainian Russians, and that the Ukraine, that it's kind of what happened. But anyway,
is this? I know nothing about this. What comes to my mind is the narcissism of small differences, where this idea that like if you can relate to people more, you're capable of sort of like hating them more. Is that? Do you have any idea like why he thought this would be the case, other than that just they're close to each other and they both have a lot of nukes?
Yes, right, exactly that. Just that you have these cultural groups that are both nuclear armed, and we're focusing just on the U.S. versus the Soviet Union, but actually it could start with some breakaway group of Ukrainians who turn against Moscow, and Moscow turns against them, and then suddenly you have a local nuclear war, which is it's a miracle we think, or we pretty much know we got, and that's what we forget about with the Ukrainians, is that they were one of the only groups that have given up their nuclear weapons. I mean, they had all those nuclear weapons in the game, and pretty much it was never put in a treaty, but the deal was that we would protect them. If they gave up their nuclear weapons, we promised to protect them. That's where the argument that it's not our business falls apart.
That's right. All right, we're in over my head at this point about like the history of NATO and things like that. But no, this makes sense. I mean, and also the threat of the conflict makes sense as well because of the proximity, both geographically and culturally. It's easy to imagine how an antagonist in that conflict would think that they know what's going on with the other side and give them a lot more confidence than, U.S. versus Russia, for example, where there's I guess there's some degree of obfuscation between our cultures and obviously the distance between us that I think would give people a lot more uncertainty around pulling the trigger. Okay. Curious to get your thoughts then, I mean, on the development of AI. So so again, we're at this point where we have not super intelligent dolphins, but things that resemble human consciousnesses in some way, or rather things that can produce output that seems like it came from a human, convincingly enough, telling us what to do. And I just want to talk a little bit more about alignment and how you see this playing out, and if you're worried about anything or if you have solutions in mind.
Yeah, well, I think we're being fed this very domesticated AI. It's just like I'm not interested in cows or chickens. There's lots of them in the world. There's more chickens in the world than anything else, but I'll eat chicken, but I really don't have that much interest in it. But I'm fascinated by wild animals, and it's the same with AI. I have no interest in this domesticated. Like I won't go near it. The domesticated AI that it drives me crazy now. Every piece of software now is let me finish your email for you. So no, I'm going to finish my own email. Go away. But wild AI, that fascinates me. I mean, and again, we're not paying attention to that. We're just looking at, these companies are trying to farm these domesticated artificial intelligences, just like farming. You raise the crop and sell it, and you're a farmer. But there's a different world. There's a wilderness out there where I've long been convinced we will get real AI, but it will be in the wild, and that's what will be interesting.
Can you define wild AI for me?
No, I mean, the same way you really can't define what it's not domesticated. Nobody controls it. Nobody's particularly profiting from it. It's just going to grow up on its own, and the way. Again, I think it's just completely, absolutely mistaken the view of these companies that we can produce AI and control it in some way. I mean, sort of by definition, real AI is not controllable, and you need to accept that. The same way when I started going up to Alaska and sleeping on the beach and stuff, you realize you are no longer the top of the food chain. You've got these large Alaska brown bears that weigh 2,000 pounds are walking up. They're there. It's their home. They walk up and down the beach. You're going to run into them, and they may eat you, but they probably won't. And you have to accept that. You can't. I mean, I guess you can be heavily armed or something, but it's the same with AI. We're going into this world where there are. I guess it's a fundamental reality that you can easily create something that you cannot understand. There's sort of this view that you have to understand how to build a car to build a car. But with AI, it's a different world. You can actually build something that you don't understand. And we're right in the middle of that right now. And it's fascinating. But it's the wild stuff that's going to be interesting, not the sort of tiger that's turned into a house cat and sits on your couch. Right.
Yeah, that you pay to purr for you when you want to. Well, I guess I'm sorry. I'm just going to be annoying and ask for more details on this. But well, first of all, I have an idea of a wild AI, but I'm going to say these, an AI as far as I'm defining it is something that it's being run on some sort of compute infrastructure that someone will own in some way and control in some way. But it's easy for me to think of something like Twitter or a social media network as creating an environment in which some culture will emerge, weird culture will come out of it. So Twitter has its own culture, Facebook has its own culture, TikTok does, Tumblr does, these are all, these different social media platforms. They create an environment in which a culture will emerge that changes how people behave. It gets them to behave in certain ways. It gets them to, it facilitates the propagation of memes and concepts in ways that are interesting. There was a dust up a few months ago of it was teenagers on TikTok that had discovered bin Laden's letter to America. And they're like, whoa, this guy had some great stuff to say. And it was just surreal. And I'm like, oh yeah, well, I guess did TikTok enable the conditions for that to happen? Am I approximating something like what you're describing in terms of a wild AI? I'm just
not maybe, but I mean, I really think it's like all these science fiction books, like The Black Cloud or something. Just when it happens, it's going to be something we really just truly cannot understand. It's at a level that's beyond. That's sort of the definition of real AI. It's not comprehensible. It's like trying to ask an ant to understand, what you're writing. It's just it can walk over the page, but it doesn't understand it.
Right.
And,
okay.
And the argument, this I also think the Turing test is wrong. That the test of a real artificial intelligence is immediately be smart enough not to reveal itself, to sort of play dumb.
Yeah.
So it's no defense in saying, oh, well, they haven't passed the Turing test yet, so don't worry about it. That doesn't. And I take this deep philosophical view that it's not necessarily a bad thing. And we talked about that before we were recording, about Jack Good sort of looking at machine.
Oh yeah. Talk about this.
Ethics of machine intelligence, ethical machines. That Jack Good worked with Alan Turing doing the decrypting in World War II, and actually wrote I think the fifth book I told you to read, The Scientist Speculates, which he went around to. Like, he was a guy, prolific writer. He wrote to all the scientists in 1960 and said, tell me your craziest ideas that you wouldn't dare publish, and I'm going to put them in a book. And it's just, you can pick up that book today and it's full of ideas about life in the sun and just wild, crazy, some of which have come true, and some are short and some are 5 pages. But anyway, he wrote a serious paper on ethical machines. That why should we presume that we have a monopoly on ethics, the same way we used to think, only people can play chess. Any machines can play chess. And we still have this we have to have a human ethical review board to make sure we have ethical AI. And he sort of gives a mathematical argument why machines could easily be more ethical than we are.
Right. Well, yeah, this is okay. So I think in my mind, there are a few ways to go from here. Like, there's the idea of an AI, an artificial intelligence, right? So in my mind, that's something that's been manufactured, so is not wild in a way, I would say. But I've said this before. I think even on this podcast, I think about it a lot. Is that, like, we've already built lots of systems that we can't control. Yes. And that we don't understand, right? So, like, democracies are one. Just the way we govern ourselves. I think markets broadly, we can't quite control or understand, and again, I think that's kind of the thrust of Anthology, is like, we're just accelerating that process because we're building such complex computational infrastructure. So there's no way. I mean, like, I don't know if you've ever watched videos of how they make, these like nanometer scale transistors. It's insane.
Yeah. People who say we don't have self-reproducing machines. We definitely have self-reproducing machines.
Yeah. And these are machines that are using like ultraviolet, like bouncing ultraviolet lasers off of molten tin or something crazy to print stuff. People can fact check me on that, but that's an approximation of like what's going on. It's something totally crazy, like these things that we've invented that like very few people on the planet could ever even come close to understanding. And so I would say we've already built, whether we would call them AIs or not, they're structures that govern our lives that we don't control or understand. So we've already done that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But then in terms of like, I guess like we could also refer to like alien intelligences that we can't conceive. I think this is what I've read, the first book of the 3-body problem. Have you read that one?
No, but I should.
Okay. You should. I think you'd enjoy it. I'm sure you would. It's very good science fiction, and there's a Netflix show that people are excited about now that I haven't watched yet. But that's a lot of it's a part of that, is that like if there is an alien intelligence that can like make it to us, it's not going to regard us as anything, And I'm reminded also after your comments of, I think this is something that if I can remember, I'll have to look it up. I'm pretty sure it was on Pete Holmes's podcast. He's a comedian who has a good podcast, but he's always asking people about their belief in God, and weird stuff like that. And his guest, who I think had been a writer for The Simpsons, he's like, look, like I can have a dog in my office and a computer in my office, and the dog has no awareness whatsoever of what that computer is. It's just this inert box. He's like, what's stopping God from like being right here, and I just don't even notice it because I can't perceive it, and that's always stuck with me. So anyway, those kinds of AIs, maybe they're already here, and we don't even know. So
yeah, that's what I think. But
yeah. Do you think they're? Do you think they're on the planet?
Well, they're I was too young when Jack Good collected that book, but my contribution would be, which I've actually talked about this with Edward Teller. My theory is that my belief is that the universe is full of life.
Okay.
It's just, I sort of think it has to be. I mean, how could you have all these billions of stars and not have, life scattered all over the place?
Yeah.
And life, by definition, it wants to spread and reproduce and sort of. But the belief in speed of light space travel is just, it doesn't work. It's not going to happen. I mean, unless you have wormholes or something like that. But we're very good at electromagnetic communication, and so life would. That's how I think it would spread. It would spread as a coded representation of itself that would then, just like a plant that produces 1 billion spores that are scattered to the winds, and it's unpredictable, but something lands somewhere. And so anyway, that's my science fiction theory, that something happened on this planet that's, a spore of, or you can imagine that you could write a science fiction story, but this is what happened.
Yeah.
But it needs a digital metabolism in which to sort of grow, and that's what's happening. Why is all this digital stuff that it could be we could be simply a sort of larval stage of something we don't understand at all, and that's the classic view of AI, or the stuff people are worried about is, there's just got to be this AI that has a self-interest and wants to talk to the president in English or something like that. But I mean, there can also be forms of AI that, like you say, like the dog and the computer, just have no interest in people at all, but are very interested in the digital kind of hardware, because that's the world they need in order to. And if there's a lot of strange things going on, like Bitcoin is sort of like this virus that infected people and made them go crazy, like mortgage their houses and put their life savings into building GPU chips for no explainable reason. But if that's what you were trying to do, it would be very effective. So anyway, so I think.
Yeah, well, and being able to hack humans like that is very beneficial to, I guess, Bitcoin as a thing. But I think that's how the labor market works anyway, right? It's sort of like, okay, I want to have a house, I want to keep up with the Joneses, et cetera, et cetera. And I mean, there are plenty of people in the tech world that like they're just hacked by corporations that are like, okay, like we'll give you a lot of money if you help us build this machine.
Yeah.
In fact, you'll appreciate this. I'll find the I'll find a link to it, and I'll put it also in the show notes, but I'll send this to you. It's this image that I use all the time of these two people who work for Google carrying the Google Street View cameras on their backs into the Grand Canyon. And it's just like, all right, who's in charge here?
Yeah.
These are pack animals that are doing the bidding of this other thing, which is Google.
Yeah, in the early days of Microsoft, they used to ask whether had you got the brain implant yet.
Go on.
Which was stock options. If you got the stock options referred to as the brain implant, then you became.
You're hacked, right?
True.
And then you'll do whatever it takes. Yeah. And so, on behalf of what?
Yeah.
What is this thing that we're building? So this goes back again to this sort of metaphor of us being kind of subject to megafauna that are just doing what they will with us, and we can't control them. This is funny. Okay. So your belief is that there's life everywhere. We'll go even further down this rabbit hole. I mean, are you and I not just encoded representations of energy? I mean, like through DNA?
Well, no, I don't believe in any. I totally don't believe in this sort of simulation hypothesis stuff. I think that again, that's provably wrong. It just
what
physics.
I'm not saying even simulation, but just that like it's one way of defining like what a human is a pattern of energy that's informed by DNA, like a genome.
Yes, yeah, nature has used digital coding for information storage, which is very, and also it's very interesting how now it's going both ways. That if you look at life as a whole, was sort of very statistical and non-replicative for a long time, and then there's good. Again, it's no longer a crazy scientific, wild idea to say that the sort of what's now our genetic system was originally there was some kind of infection that infected these non-replicating cells and made them replicate, and then that was adopted because it's advantageous to replicate, and so you look at it from life's point of view, the DNA way of doing it is primitive in a certain way, and that actually so if you take a long-term view, probably genetically engineered organisms are going to take over. It may start with chickens or whatever, but we're kind of heading that way where more and more we're influencing the genetic code is being transferred into computer memory rather than strictly DNA memory, and that has all sorts of implications for the future.
Well, right. Well, I mean, the main one though being sort of going back to your everything that's bad that's ever happened because someone wanted it to. Like, who decides what gets replicated?
Exactly.
In that case, yeah. Right? Yeah. So it'd be like, oh, you know what? Like, using chickens as an example or whatever. Like, this is a protein that humans like to eat. It's a good vehicle for marinades and sauces, which is my opinion on chicken. And we need more of them. And so we're going to create a genetically modified chicken. And that ends up being like the main protein source.
Yeah.
That, I don't know. I don't see that ending well.
No, and that was, Nils Baricelli is another character in several of my books. This Norwegian viral geneticist and who also had a way of just writing these papers that were way ahead of their time, but he was trying to understand the origins of the genetic code and did these early digital evolution experiments. But he wrote a very interesting paper arguing that humans, if you look at social organisms like social insects and stuff, they all evolved to where there is a single replicating line, like the queen of the termite colony, and then there's all the drones who do the work, but they don't replicate.
Oh, interesting.
And he said that humans are unique as a social species that hasn't got there yet, but that's where he thinks we're going to go.
Whoa.
And you can see that as, again, I mean, there's of course no end of science fiction stories on that theme. Just that you have the replicating class and the non-replicating working class.
Right. Well, this is we'll go back to God for a second. I mean, I tend to think that like there is some sort of primal desire that humans have of being rescued or otherwise assured that things are okay. Which in my opinion, things actually are okay. That's a fundamental truth of the universe, is that it is what it is. But anyhow, but people really want to have this sort of reassurance. And so like a big part of like belief in God is this notion that like, there's something out there that at some point it will take me up and everything will be fine at that point. I think, not to get too like Freudian, and I really don't know what I'm talking about when it comes to psychology, but like, just the way like it feels like for a baby to be picked up by its mother or father and feel assured. Like we have a primal desire for that. And I wonder if that does inform a lot of fantasies around technology, where they actually want what you describe. They're like, no, we'll have the ChatGPT that will just tell us what to do, and it'll be fine.
Yeah, that's the only of the books I mentioned, the only one that really has a spoiler. We can't go there, but Childhood's End.
Okay,
it's got the spoiler, but it's based. That religion has in some way prepared us for the arrival of the aliens.
Okay.
So you have to read the book.
It's over there. I'm looking at it. So, okay. Well, I'll have you back to talk about that.
Well,
the Black Cloud was awesome. I finished it a couple weeks ago. We should do one on that if you're up for it.
Sure.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So I just want to talk about Analogia one more time, because this discussion of sort of binary encoding of data and then communicating, through the electromagnetic spectrum made me think of this. Is that you talk about in Analogia, this guy Samuel Butler, who he's like way out in New Zealand, the middle of nowhere, it sounded like. And the first telegraph line is installed. And so this is from his journal that you quoted. We will say then that a considerable advance has been made in mechanical development, when all men in all places, without any loss of time, are cognizant through their senses of all that they desire to be cognizant of in all other places, at a low rate of charge, so that the backcountry squatter may hear his wool sold in London and deal with the buyer himself, may sit in his own chair in a backcountry hut and hear the performance of Israel in Gypt at Exeter Hall, may taste an ice on the racaille, which he is paying for and receiving in the Italian Opera House Covent Garden. Multiply instance ad libitum. This is the grand annihilation of time and place for which we are all striving for, and which in some small part we have been permitted to see actually realized. This is wild to me.
Right, that's 1863, and the telegraph line is 11 miles long. It's an 11-mile telegraph, and he has this vision. I mean, it's like eBay, PayPal, and YouTube. Yeah.
Right, and he's seeing a future where we're synthesizing foods and things like that, and all any kind of sensory experience through digital encoding. I guess I'm going to take his word on it, because he was right about so much of it that we'll get to the place where I can eat ice cream or whatever over the internet. But and Leibniz had the same vision in the 1600s when he sort of discovered binary encoding. Is that right?
Yeah.
How do you have any idea? To my feeble mind, would have never come to conclusions even remotely like this. Do you have any notion of how people are able to see this far when they understand?
Well, you should remember
power of communication.
Samuel Butler, had left England and gone to New Zealand in 1950. He was a troublesome kid, and his father didn't kick him out, but he had to leave London. So, he was voracious, as people were. There was nothing to do, and that he was farming sheep in a remote wilderness in New Zealand. But he had a copy of Charles Darwin's book, so he had read Charles Darwin's book and on all these, and he just sort of started thinking, well, if this applies to animals, it applies to machines, and just went wild with it.
Okay, well, clearly. But I mean, I don't know. I'm just I'm astonished that at the foresight, and I mean, I don't know. I guess it's true. He makes a big assumption here, though. I love this: the grand annihilation of time and place, which we are all striving for. I never would have said that I was striving for that, but maybe that's true too.
Well, you have to remember, it's at that time, it took him. It took 3 months to get to Australia on the fastest ship.
Right.
You could, if you were sent a letter to Australia, and you caught the fastest ships at exactly the right time, you'd get an answer in half a year.
Yeah.
So,
Okay, fair. I guess I take it for granted now that I don't have to deal with that. But there's also something to be said that I think is really interesting about how we experience reality, and what digital technology has to offer. Is actually, it was Esther when I asked her to be on this podcast, for which I'm still trying to. I'm going to make it happen. But she's like, I'd want to discuss Her, the movie. Do you know this movie?
Yes.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, my takeaway from Her is that you know, to be seduced by an AI, it doesn't matter if it's intelligent or not. It just has to be like convincing enough for you to be like, okay, you know, I'm going to go along with what you say. And it feels real enough. And I think there's something really fascinating to this idea that, like, if the technology gets good enough, this idea that, like, I'm going to be eating an ice, which I guess is, let's say it's ice cream.
Or sherbet or something.
Sure. Whatever. It doesn't, you could synthesize it. You could synthesize the experience of it, and I could experience it through some digital, through some artificial means. And if you get it right, it doesn't really matter that it's not real anymore. And there's an image in Her that I love of I guess Joaquin Phoenix, just sort of despondent, depressed, and he sits in front of a huge screen, and on the screen it's just like a digital billboard or something like that, and it's an eagle, or not, it's an owl coming in to catch his prey, and it's just, you know, this awesome shot of it, just he's been captured. And again, speaking of like megafauna, it's just sort of like we're just setting ourselves up to be captured by something.
Yeah, and we're there. I mean, I can't remember when that movie came out, but boy, we've got there quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. It was 2013.
Yeah. So 10 years and a lot of it is just on the people side, that people are, I think, you know, we're getting more and more data that people are actually quite happy to have a artificial girlfriend. I mean, it's not at all. You'd think people would be horrified by that or something, but no, they're like, where can I get one? Yeah.
Well, that's the funny thing about the movie too, is that he's like, oh yeah, no, I'm dating an operating system, and everyone's like, cool. Like, it's never an issue. Now, are you worried about this future?
Yes, but you know, I learned that from my father too. That just you no matter how worried you are, you should still be optimistic. It's sort of where we came up from, this, you know, thermonuclear weapon thing, where there's this absolute destruction hanging over our heads, but we still have to be optimistic, because otherwise, you give up.
Yeah.
But it's, you know, Analogius, to sort of get back to books, that book started. The original idea was it had an opening chapter and a closing chapter that were science fiction, and then and both those got dropped. And what you got was the middle part that was not fiction, but the fictional opening and the fictional ending were. I just gave up. I can't write fiction. It's sort of a thing that you either have or you don't. I don't think I have.
Yeah. Can you give me the pitch though?
Yeah.
It's
quite simple, because there's traces of it. I mean, so the original opening chapter was in the Aleutian Islands 10,000 before the Russians arrived. The current opening chapter is when the Russians arrived, but this was a chapter set before the Russians arrived. So you have a very advanced technological civilization who's been living in these islands for 10,000 years, but they don't have a written language. They don't need it, and everything's fine. And then, then one day the Russians show up with their religion and their written language, and everything changes. And then the whole book happens. And then the ending chapter was going to be back in the Aleutians, 1,000 years ahead or whatever, and where the whole world has become this, exactly what we're getting, kind of a big AI where all the humans are cells in a multicellular organism, but are, given instructions as to what to do and happily do it.
Yeah.
But even the sort of governing AI realizes that you need to keep some sort of wild preserve of the way people were. And the Aleutian Islands are the perfect place. So the Aleutian Islands are back to kind of their original civilization, where you do everything you want, but you can't have any digital technology. But every once in a while, somebody will see a drone go by or something like that. But otherwise, life is the same as it was 10,000 years ago. And I wanted to write that, but I just couldn't do it.
It's tough. No, what you're grasping with is hard. It's hard to articulate too. And
it now is all these cultural appropriation issues where, who am I to tell the story of what life was like in the Aleutians before them?
Right. So. Right. Well, and then also, what is the optimal way for humans to ever have lived or whatever? It gets really complicated. Oh man, I love that though. Do you know who Miyazaki is? Hayao Miyazaki?
Yes. Yeah.
I feel like his movies are these artifacts of a lost humanity all the time. That's like the vibe that I find so there's a lot of things I find compelling about his movies, but like part of it is there's always kind of like a longing for a somewhat more human existence than we have now. I think that's intentional on his part. I think I've read something about that, but anyhow, this has been awesome. Well, George, thank you for this. We covered a lot of ground. These books can be a jumping off point to really interesting discussions. So I hope to have you back on in the future.
Thanks for having me here. Thank you.
All right, that was great. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Talking to George was just amazing. I fully admit to being out of my depth on multiple occasions, but that's okay. That's kind of the point. I want to talk to people who know a lot more about a lot of things than I do, and this is one way to do it. So I think it's amazing that this is the 5th episode of the podcast, and here we are talking about humans just being binary data that may have been sent from outer space or who knows what. I suppose that kind of thing would be inevitable with this kind of podcast, and here we are pretty early on, so I feel pretty good about that. Anyhow, I hope you all enjoyed it. If you like the podcast, please let me know. I always want to hear from people. I want to hear from people about suggestions on who I should be talking to and on what we should be talking about. I'm always open to suggestions. And as always, the music for Text on Text is by Secret School. And this song, the outro music that you're hearing right now, is 3/10 of the Population by We. Next month, we'll be talking to Io Blair Fries about 2 Borges stories, one called The Zahir, and the other one called An Examination of the Works by Herbert Quain, or something along those lines. Some Borges stories have these very long titles that I can never remember. But anyway, they'll be great. You can see on the website, texontext.net. I always announce what'll be coming up next. If you're on X, you can follow Text on Text there. It's just x.com/textontext. And yeah, thanks again to George for doing this. I loved it. I love talking to him. I'm going to have him back on. He had me read all these books, and I want to do at least 2 more episodes with him. So no idea when that'll happen, but stay tuned. Anyway, thanks for listening, and hopefully you'll tune in next month. Later.